This is Illuminate, the podcast about men with good hearts, open minds, and a desire to make the world better. Welcome to Illuminate. I'm your host, Chris Tidrick, and I'm here with my good friend, James Quisenberry. James is a son, husband, and father who is comfortable in all of these roles. He has developed a philosophy of leadership and service through a variety of career experiences and volunteering in his community. A strong believer in coaching and mentorship, he continues to find both individuals he can learn from and future leaders he can encourage and support. James and I have known each other for over a decade, and I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot today. So good to have you on the show, James.
Thank you, Chris. I'm glad to be a part of it.
We jump right in and talk about motivation. So I'd love for you to give me a sense of what's your why? Where do you find purpose? What drives you?
So I started out as a person who thought I was going to write code and be a software developer, and that was going to be my life. And dove into computer science all in. And then I realized being in computer science is just having a tool to accomplish things. And what I found was that the area of expertise I wanted to practice that in was education. And so that has driven kind of my professional why all the way through every job I've had, which is how do we take technology and make and support education to help people learn, help people grow.
Let me hear a little bit about your journey. Take me along the journey. Share whatever you'd like in that journey, but really any lessons learned that you had, any kind of points where you pivoted, had like moments of great awareness. I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, I have to talk, when I talk about my journey, I have to talk about a place of privilege that I came from. I came from a household with two strong parents who were good teammates in their journey, in their profession, in their family. And so I had like the best kind of foundation that someone can have. And I started out, both my parents were academics, so I was going to college. I was going to find a professional career to pursue, and that was kind of like the roadmap. And then I got out into the world and started pursuing that, and hit the first road bump, which was pursuing. I initially thought I'd end up with a doctorate in computer science, but I started that process after 6 years of getting a bachelor's and master's and realized, oh my gosh, I have been in this, taking classes and moving forward too long. I need to
that's a long
step
time.
away.
Yeah.
And so I had come to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which is where I've been all my life, expecting to work on a PhD for 4 years. And after 2 months, I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do. And I shifted gears and worked with a department on campus that was delivering education through technology. And that's how the rest of the story started out for that process. And I thought I would be doing that on campus. And then the recession of the early 90s happened, and the department I was in was shut down. And the tool that we were working on got moved into the private sector. So that started a whole different adventure for me, which involved not so much writing code anymore, but managing. At that time, we thought they were high-speed networks and nothing like what we have today. But getting into a completely different world and starting to manage people leading technology rather than being the technologist. And so I spent some time in the private sector, and that was exciting. Exciting both in a terrorizing way and an opportunity kind of way. And I went through a couple of occurrences where both the people above me in the hierarchy left the company on the same day. 3 of them were fired.
Wow.
And one of them quit because the other person was fired. And so I had you have to be comfortable with change in that kind of environment. And I learned to be comfortable with change, but I also learned that there's only so much change you can put up with for a long time before it starts to to not be exciting anymore. And
So
so
where did
that's
where
when
did you where did you land in that?
I feel like I've always had a kind of blessed and lucky path. I always kind of found myself in the right place as things changed. Only one misstep where I thought I should join a tech startup in 2002, which, if you know the history of the .com bust, was not the right time to shift from a
Yeah.
large, solid corporation to a startup. That was one minor step along the way. But at the end of it, at the end of that private sector experience, I wanted to get back to higher education because that's what I had a lot of familiarity with. That's where I started out. That's where we could focus on longer term outcomes as
Yeah.
opposed to next quarter's profits and how we
Yeah.
were doing financially. And so that's when I came back to the University of Illinois and have been supporting technology and student affairs, housing, and various other non-academic parts of the campus operation since then.
So I want to ask a little bit, maybe a little bit more about your parents. You said they were both academics. What did they do?
Yeah, it's interesting. Both of my parents graduated. They met each other at Indiana State University over in Terre Haute, and they both got their degrees in education. My dad had been in the military, so he's a little bit older than the rest of the college students at ISU, and he kind of knew what he wanted. He met my mom, and they kind of decided they knew what they wanted, so they went into teaching. My dad taught high school at in Indianapolis in Speedway, which is a small one of the cities that makes up Indianapolis, and my mom taught inner city elementary school, and they both they both kept going forward. They both got their master's degree from Indiana State, and then they went on to get their PhDs at Indiana University. By that time, I was part of the package. I
Okay.
was born in Indianapolis and moved to Bloomington, Indiana, and they both finished their PhDs, and they both became a part of the faculty at Southern Illinois University in the College of Education. And I think I've told you this before, but one of the interesting things about our household were my parents were teammates, but my mom was kind of the lead. She ended
Hmm.
up, after just a few years, she moved to the dean's office, was an assistant dean, was the first woman to be an assistant dean in the College of Ed at Southern Illinois University, and she moved up, became an associate dean, and retired as the dean of the College of Education. My dad was faculty in curriculum instruction, focusing on children's literature, and I mean he had a very successful career. But it was clearly in my household, my mom was both the caregiver and the support person, and also the lead income person for the household and the organizer um, and so I kind of had I would call it a little bit non-traditional experience for the 70s in the United States, right? So
Yeah,
that
absolutely. There
we
weren't a lot of
there
moms as primary breadwinners when we were growing
I
up.
did not grow up with a perception that gender was a part of defining how you participated in the workplace, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah. At what point did you kind of notice that that wasn't the norm? I mean, when you're a kid and you're in that environment, you're likely like, "Oh, okay, this is just how things are." But like, when did that become apparent to you that it was not
yeah,
the
it
norm?
didn't. I didn't. Because Carbondale is a university town. My friends' parents, while their moms might have not have been the lead breadwinner in the household, they were all they all had very strong intellectual interests and interests outside of just being moms. And so it didn't
Yeah.
really catch up to me until I started working in the private sector and I would frequently go out with our sales force. And as we were selling this online education tool to high schools and middle schools and so forth, they would sometimes need a technology person to write alongside. And I came across some circumstances where I saw leaders in school districts, men, who would treat some of our salespeople who were women very differently than how they would treat me.
Yeah.
It was, I wasn't naive, but it was kind of a take my shoulders and shake me a little bit kind of experience
Yeah.
to learn that was a part of some people's behavior, and it was it was disturbing, and it generated some reaction from me that probably was outside of my role at the time to make comments about how people were behaving.
Yeah.
It's hard to, I'm a sales engineer is the best way you could describe what I'm doing, and this is like the superintendent of a school district
So
who's
the
who's
main
out of line.
stakeholder, yeah, yeah,
The
the
kind
main
of thing that we
stakeholder
teach
of like,
people
yeah,
now is to
yeah,
speak up when something gets out of line, and I really didn't have the capacity to influence that situation.
yeah. It's definitely a different world back then. As you progress through your career, how is that, your mother's role, sort of the perspective of your childhood, how has that influenced you, in how you think about, whether it's gender issues in the workplace or just general equity issues overall?
Yeah, it certainly made me a person who has always looked at anybody I work with, regardless of gender or other ways they might be different, as a partner. My mom is my parents both were role models in certain aspects of my life. My mom was certainly my professional role model, and
Mhm.
someone I still think about when I think about my career in higher education, because she did that, and that's where she succeeded. And it is always, you know, I I have to be conscious about situations that arise where gender starts to be an issue in interpersonal conversations, because I have to remind myself that people are not seeing this the way I feel about it, and
Yeah.
I have to be conscious about that. I've certainly seen a lot more of that than I prefer to see, and have learned how to be supportive and address things as they arise as I've become more senior leader and been responsible for creating the climate that we have in our organization. But um, it has meant that I've had full professional relationships with anybody who I've come across, because
Yeah.
I'm not stuck on the gender roles.
So I know, and I know this because we've been friends for a while. There's more to your story than just kind of working in academia. You have a side to you, that, in working with your community. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk. Maybe I haven't talked to you about this, so this will be maybe new for you. But one of the
Yeah.
things um, I learned from a very early age, to help organize and to help focus groups that I was in, and what I've had somebody that I interviewed about leadership who said they didn't really like leadership, but nobody else was getting things organized, and so that over
Mhm.
time,
Yeah.
they developed that knack.
Yeah.
And I found there was a certain point in my career where I found that I felt like I had more leading to do than the hierarchy I was in allowed for.
Yeah.
And so it branched out. I addressed that by branching out and leading in my community, whether that
And
was,
how have you done that?
yeah, so whether it was serving on the library board and becoming a part of the governing body for the library consortium in the area, or being part of the Children's Museum board and moving up to serve as the president of that organization, and then finally like running for public office which I first ran for a county board seat and served in our county's governing board for 6 years. And now I'm serving on the Urbana City Council, another elected position where, I work with a small group of other people that help us figure out how to support and run our city.
Yeah, I liked how you characterized you were you had this initiative to lead, and you didn't necessarily have it in your professional life, and so you found those opportunities in your personal life. I also think in knowing you and knowing myself that I think there are those of us who have a lower tolerance for chaos, and so we step into those leadership roles when we see that vacuum.
Yeah, I mentioned that person who I interviewed. She's now vice president for student affairs in Florida at a university in Florida. But I interviewed her. We were doing a conference presentation on how people became leaders. And that was her story. Her story was, I just hated that people weren't organized. From the time she was in like middle
Yeah,
school, she she leaned towards bringing order out of the chaos. And so her feeling was that by the time she got to workplace kind of experience, she'd been practicing being a leader for 20 years. Right.
yeah,
And so,
yeah, and
uh,
we can take we can take that internal motivation, and it can turn into leadership, or it can turn into micromanagement, and like it's healthy when it turns into leadership, I think.
yeah.
One of the things we talk about on this podcast is growth and how we grow. And your your background and your upbringing, I think, is different than some of the other guests we've had on the show. But I do want to ask you, the several of the other guests have shared like things that they were brought up with, that they then realized don't work for them later in life. And in order to grow into the person that they are today, they've had to deconstruct something that was sort of foundational from the past. So is there anything in your life that you've had to deconstruct?
Well, yes. Growing up, I went to middle school and high school in the 70s and early 80s. There was a lot of social norms that were common then that aren't common now, and not and so a lot of the things that I was influenced by with what was like accepted, I had to kind of let go of as I move forward, as the world moved forward, right? Because the world had that kind of evolution. More recently, the thing I've been thinking a lot about is ableism, because
Mm,
I have an unconscious tendency to be impatient, or I would say judgmental about individuals who have some challenges. And the thing about bias can happen without you even thinking about it. It can be
yeah,
built into you. So the important thing about bias is how you learn to recognize it, and how you learn to, in the space of those, blinks of an eye,
yeah,
transition what your reaction is into how you act. That's one of the things. The other thing that I've worked a lot on is, I'm a I'm somewhat of a fan of the Myers-Briggs tools, not from a standpoint that I believe they define anybody, but they certainly help me understand interpersonal interactions that don't go well for me. And that
yeah,
that usually lines up. I'm in Myers-Briggs. There's an intuitive side, and there's a what they call sensing side, N and S. And I'm like 100% in. My mind like runs down paths, like hop, skip, and jump. It does not worry about the details to go down those paths. And I work with a lot of people, senior staff, who are sensors, who really need to to feel and touch and see all sides of the thing that we're talking about and know more of the implications, which I the ambiguity that I'm tolerant of, they are not tolerant of. And I've had to learn how to recognize when my tactics or my behaviors are, running towards that intuitive side, and I'm working with a person who leans
Yeah.
towards the sensing side. And it's like, okay, mentally in my head, I know what's going to satisfy them about what I'm trying to
Yeah.
accomplish. And I can translate, where I was from, it just makes sense, to here's the steps that lead to that, or here's the data that supports that. And that's something that, we see this, you and I see this in technology. We have a mix of introverts and extroverts. We have people who can talk their way through a decision, and we have people that think their way through to a decision.
Yeah.
And you have to give space to both types if you're going to get the best answer out of the whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you're describing there to me is sort of that foundation of empathy. It's that willingness to look through the world through somebody else's lens, right?
Yeah.
And your predisposition to education. You grew up in this education environment. Um, I think that, in what I know of you, you have this like predisposition to learn. If I look at the UI and you and I and a common friend of ours have an ongoing text chat that's been going on for probably 2 or 3 years now, and there's always like new opportunities to learn in that text chat. We're always sharing new information that we find out from people. But how do you go about learning, and how do you make sure that you're always learning and sort of you're open to it?
That comes from two things for me. It comes from relationships, interacting with other people, because that's where I learn a lot of what I learn is from the both what other people know and how they see things. There's two dimensions to that. And then I read a lot. I I am I I try to stay very current on what's going on in the world. So I chase after the news all the time to see what's how things are emerging. But I also have, like a subscription to Science News, which is a magazine that's focused on, what's changing in the world of discovery. And I don't read as much from a standpoint of like, here's a book I'm going to read, but I have over time like focused that kind of reading on, frankly, nonfiction. So,
Mm,
I want to know more about how Ben Franklin did what he did, and how
yeah.
did George Washington do what he did. So that drives my reading outside of what I would call more like current events and current science kind of sources.
You had me at nonfiction. I think they're if you looked at if you looked at my entire library, it would, I think, be 99.5% nonfiction. I'm not a big reader of fiction for some reason. Although there's a ton of insight you can learn from fiction, but there's so much fascinating out there in nonfiction.
I read a lot of like Tolkien and science fiction and all kinds of not fiction works early in my life, and so
Yeah,
I got a lot of that maybe out of my way early on.
yeah,
But I'm not saying I don't do it ever, but it's just not
yeah.
these days. It's not quite as interesting to me as stuff that helps me understand how the world's working.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about community. It's one of the issues that as I've been, having these conversations with podcast guests, and as I've been thinking about this, like the importance of community for men in this world where, whether it's social media or the fact that we're on screens all the time, that men can feel somewhat isolated in their lives. I guess suppose anybody can feel isolated in their lives, but I want to talk to you about community and like what do you and who do you rely on for support, and where do you find and create community?
Well, yeah, I thought about this a little bit, and one of the things that um, makes my life easier is I'm an only child. and I get, because I know you sent me something that had, who do you support on, and I thought about this, and in reality, I have a lot of coping skills as an only child that maybe others don't have if they grew up in a
Yeah.
larger family model, right? Um, I do depend on my wife. We've been we've known each other for over 40 years, and we've been married for 36 years so far. And
That's an
we're
accomplishment.
we're a good team, and those so those two core things make me resilient in ways that maybe others don't
Hmm.
have. But I also I always have. I've noticed this. I always have somewhere between 2 to 4 deep friendships at any point in my life outside of my marriage, and that has most of those have been men, not all of them, but
Yeah.
it's usually a couple of people that I can really go to and say, here's what's going on, and
Yeah.
they're very comfortable telling me, how it is,
Yeah.
whether it's
Yeah.
validation or whether it's an appropriate question at the right time.
Yeah.
uh,
Those,
and
those people
and
are really important to have.
yeah, I don't know if it's become harder to find that, but I think I don't know that, one of the things about this podcast is I take for granted a lot of the structures that were around when I developed, which I'm
Okay.
not sure are there now. And so I think it's important to get this kind of out there and share it,
Yeah.
and so other people can maybe find help with it.
Yeah. How have you mentioned that over time, it's usually three or four, close friendships that you have. How has that evolved for you? I know in my own life, it has been in the last decade where I've sort of solidified those, and there's been kind of a constancy in those relationships. But prior to that, I felt like my friendships like constantly morphed from person to person over time. So how has that worked for you?
Well, I would say that half of it is based on what I do during the day, right? I
Hmm.
mean, half of those relationships are involving people that I work with.
Yeah.
Um, if I look back at who were my close friends in high school, you know, I'm still connected to a couple of them, but they're not that role now. And
Yeah.
then in college, that changed. And then in my first job on campus, that changed. And then when I went into the private sector, that changed a bit. But what has happened as it's, circumstances um, move people in and out of your life. And so I found that when one of those, rocks that are a part of my foundation move on,
Yeah.
or we're not interacting, somebody else kind of develops and fills that space. And I don't know if it's if it's again, it could be just fortunate how things have worked out, but I think it has something to do also with um, how I engage with people. I'm pretty quick to start to be vulnerable and genuine with people once I start to get, not at first, but once I start to
Yeah.
get to know them. And so maybe I have a skill in developing those kinds of
Developing
relationships
the new
as time goes
relationships,
forward.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it evolves over time, yeah.
And I've had some
I've
practice doing it. So now I can do it.
yeah, yeah, and I've kind of felt the same way that over time, I think I quickly evolve those relationships, because I develop them quickly, right? That's the it's I make new friendships very quickly, so I can relate to that. We're at the point now, in the podcast where we go into our lightning round. And that's where I ask you 11 questions. Um, expecting relatively short answers. If we want to dive into one of them that's particularly interesting, let's feel free to do that. I may ask some follow-up questions as we go along. But these are the same 11 questions that I'm asking everyone as we go through. So the first one is, what are your top 3 values?
I'm cheating because we've talked about this before. So honesty, fairness, and curiosity, I think, are the top 3.
And why do you value those?
The rise. Well, I think I've talked about this before with other folks. Honesty and fairness feel ingrained to me. They are things that, when they're absent, I have a reaction to a physical feeling that goes along with it, and so I can really say that there's a connection to those that goes beyond the conscious.
Yeah, I've seen that reaction in you.
And curiosity. I mean, learning and discovering, and I love to see how organizations and systems work. If you're curious, you're going to end up understanding things better, and that'll help you do the right thing.
So who is one role model that you've had in your life?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. My mom is probably the strongest, consistent role model for me.
Who do you hope you're a role model for?
That's also an easy question to answer, because I have one child. I have a son, and I hope to set examples and lay a path for him that helps him be successful.
Out of curiosity, if you don't mind answering, how has he navigated being an only child as compared to how you've navigated that?
It's really hard to compare it because I did not have COVID, and my son spent a year and a half of his high school experience in the COVID model, which is just really unlike anything that we had experienced in our lifetime. And it was at a lot. I know a lot of my longer term high school relationships, the ones that I still am kind of connected to people on, really gelled in that junior and senior year.
Yeah.
And he didn't have that. I mean, not in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. My son went through the same thing, and I think there are going to be major research studies that are done on the impact of the pandemic on the kids that were in high school during that era and during that time, and to see what happens to them. So thank you for
By the way, to take a sidestep on that, I totally agree with you, but I don't think it's going to be all bad.
Maybe not.
That event triggered some exploration and some capabilities that we've never seen before, and we don't know how that's going to turn out for the better.
Absolutely. I guess I would say that I think they're going to find an impact, right? And it's going to be a long-lasting impact from that. What's one way that you make the world a better place for others?
Well, I think leverage is always good, right? So I support organizations that make a difference, right? In my community, I find organizations that are having impacts, whether they're small or large, and by supporting them, either by my time or my financial support, I amplify their ability to do what they do.
What's the hardest thing about being you in today's world?
We're going to circle back to values and fairness. And the hardest thing is, watching things happen that I believe are unfair in our society, in our workplace. Even in my church, that I can't really reach in and fix.
How do you deal with that? I feel the same thing on a hourly basis. How do you cope with that?
I think about what I can do. Right. What's the that circles back to help the organizations that are making a difference in your community. That's the Mr. Rogers quote, when things are going bad, look at the helpers and focus on
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
What's your favorite emotion?
Humor,
Hmm.
laughing, finding something that triggers laughter is probably my favorite.
Yeah.
I don't know how you identify that as a single emotion, because there's a number of things that can make me laugh out loud, and it's not like one
Yeah.
thing, but that's a gift.
It's almost impossible not to feel good when you're laughing, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's something about it. Even if it's a maniacal laugh, there's still positive in it, right?
Yeah, all forms of
Yeah.
humor have their
Yeah.
certain value, whether it's joyful humor or
Yeah.
cynical humor.
What's your least favorite emotion?
Despair,
Dive into that a
that
little bit.
moment.
Why?
When you have moments, and I've had them, where you don't see how you're going to get around something that's happened that's either tragic or sad or life changing.
What brings you the most joy in life?
So that's a hard question, because so many things strike me as joyful. I do enjoy singing. I can tell you that we have a tradition on our campus called Dial a Carol, where people come and take calls and sing Christmas carols for people who request them, and that's I sing in church, I sing at that kind of thing. The other thing that I want to mention is observing people experiencing success, whether it's a group success that I'm a part of, or if I'm coaching someone and they have a breakthrough in moving themselves forward, or even watching the Fighting Illini win a basketball game and everybody's around celebrating it. That those two things, singing and celebrating success, are near the top.
Yeah, a previous guest answered to the least favorite, answered envy, and like envy is the opposite of that, right? It's the opposite of celebrating others. What makes you most proud of yourself?
I'm pretty happy with my parent experience. Seeing the young man that my son has become, and knowing, I'm not responsible for that solely, but I gave him the foundation, right? I think back to what my parents did for me. I gave him a safe foundation, and both in challenging him and supporting him to get him there. That's probably the most important, longest lasting thing that I can look at and be happy with.
It's a beautiful thing. Where can you feel the most yourself?
That group of people that I have around me, that are my wife and my several close friends. I can be myself around them, and that is the most comforting thing. Everywhere else I'm at, I am kind of on stage, and we know that, you and I both know that being a leader on stage, there are times where you can't be completely the self that you are, and so those individuals that I have that depth of friendship with and relationship with, that it's okay if I behave badly occasionally in that circumstance, because one, they'll hold me accountable if it's out of line, and two, they'll forgive me, because it's a moment. It's not a reflection of the whole me.
Yeah. That ability to let our guard down is like so freeing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One last question. This is a way to kind of tie up the conversation. What's the one thing that you hope people take away from this conversation?
Moving your own personal development forward can be really hard, and no matter what a self-help book says, there's no shortcuts to the gift of experience. But even though it's hard, I think I encourage people to push through and to, work through their questions. It's okay to have them, because when you get to the other side, you will be stronger and you will be able to cope with that thing you've worked with better, as you go forward. So don't skimp on the hard work. You need to do it, and you'll get a reward for it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful way of ending this, and it's actually it's quite the it's quite the segue into how I normally end these podcasts, and it's by saying thank you for your time today. This has been amazing, and keep up the hard work.
All right, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, James. You can learn more about Illuminate at illuminate.substack.com. We are also streaming on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and YouTube. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you at the next episode of Illuminate.